Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the fourth in the series of the Ask the Pet Food Pro Chats, brought to you by Pet Food Forum 2021 and the editors of Pet Food Industry, the magazine and digital content provider with decades of providing the market with pet food expertise. I'm Debbie Phillips Donaldson, editor-in-chief, and I'll be moderating our chat today. Ask the Pet Food Pro is a great opportunity to reach out to an industry expert, ask the questions that are most on your mind, or just listen to your peers while you're gathering details to help you and your company provide quality pet food and pet treats. Today's chat is generously supported by Peel Plastics. Thanks very much to them. Our expert today, talking about sustainability in pet food packaging, is Dr. Scott Whiteside, professor with Clemson University. So welcome, Scott.
Good morning, Debbie. Good morning, everyone.
So we're going to dive right into the discussion, folks. Thanks to everyone who submitted a question beforehand. We're going to try to get through as many of those as we can, although we did receive quite a few. And we also want to try to cover, as many as we can that are being submitted right now. So if we don't get to your questions, sorry, but we will try to get to as many as we can. So Scott, can you please provide an overview of sustainability in pet food packaging and where you think it stands right now?
Yeah, obviously we've been talking in the packaging industry. I've been working in the packaging industry for over 20-something years now. And I can remember early on in my career making presentations on future trends in packaging. And one of those, both for human food and or pet food, was the sustainable or environment or recyclability, reuse, all those buzzwords we've heard over the years. And obviously that's gained a lot of momentum in the last 5 years to 10 years and continues to move down. And there's been some technological advances that help us in that arena. But I would say, Debbie, the main thing I always try to remind people in the packaging field, no matter what your product is, there's some fundamental principles of both economics and science and consumer behavior and sort of regulatory things that we cannot get away from. The first one I would say is sustainable wise is the major thing to be focused on first and foremost is if there is not economic sustainability to whatever we're doing, then we won't be here. Because every pet food company, every human food company that I work with is in business to make money. So there has to be an economic driver or an economic puller through the market to make the packaging option work. So we can't get away from in any movement in our packaging, whatever it is, whether it's sustainable, non-sustainable. If you remember your basic economics class, you had supply and demand. This price went up, more demanded, or price went up, more less demanded, price went up, more supplied. And then you had a basic cost curve for a purely competitive macroeconomic business. And in that, we're operating at the lowest cost, and everybody's business is pretty close to that lowest cost curve. And so any movement in packaging takes you out of that. And so you have to understand that if you say we want to be more sustainable, then cost of the packaging is going to go up, and you cannot get away from that. If we can find options that are less cost increase, that's a good option. So that has to be the first one. We can't ignore that. And I'm starting to hear more people, both foreign and domestic, that are actually addressing that. When you go to conferences or you have talks on sustainability, the first thing some people are starting to address is it's got to be economically sustainable. So that's the first one. And you hear a lot of people saying that. Used to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that was just sort of, they ignored that part of the equation. The second part would be the consumer themselves. Are the consumers themselves concerned about it? Not verbally or mentally, but are they financially concerned about it? Are they willing to spend their resources on packaging that is sustainable for a certain pet food product? And so I would say to any company, you need to really understand the consumer, not your consumer, but the consumer of the specific product you're looking to market. So if you've come with a new product and you're ready to come to market with it, who is that consumer? What do they look like? Who's the primary? And then what are their opinions and what are their, push buttons on sustainable packaging? Do they have the resources to pay for it? Because it's going to cost more, as we already said. Second, are they willing to spend those resources for that? So that's, you can't get away from those two things. A family of 5, your mother and dad working, got, 3 kids or something, and they got a couple of pets, then they're not going to maybe spend the money on sustainable packaging for that increased cost. Then let's say a millennial that's living by themselves, don't have kids yet, or a retired person that has a good bit of disposable income, they may do it. Different consumers. So we got to know who our consumer is. The third part of it would be some regulatory things. There are going to be certain states and certain countries that have certain regulatory things. So that can help us with, that economic part. There'll be some justification for the economics because of a regulatory compliance to be able to do. But then also too, we can't go the sustainable route. And this is the final component, I guess, is our products. If we want to take ingredients out on the human food side, we've been taking ingredients out that were there for preserving the food, making it last longer. So the packaging have to contribute to that. The same thing is true in the pet industry. Is we see now clean labels. We see people with single source ingredients, those kind of things. One of my pets, we have to buy certain ingredient for that pet that's got allergies for others. Well, then we start taking out certain things in the product, then the packaging's going to have to increase in its barrier properties, its performance, those kind of things to do. And then I guess finally the packaging itself, sustainable packaging will not supply all the needs we have and the functions we have in a package as we speak right now. Most of the time, they're going to have to be combined with something else in the marketplace that's already there. So I hope that maybe gets us started a little bit. If you'd like, I can pick one of these questions and we can go from there, or what would you prefer, David?
Sorry, I was struggling to unmute myself because I was responding to a chat.
No problem.
Sorry about that, folks. We've had a question. These chats are being made available as recordings after the fact. This one will probably be available within a week at the most, and you will receive an email about that. So back to some of the things you addressed, and I think you make a very good point about sustainability needed to be also economically sustainable. It seems to me, just from a lot of the things we're hearing from companies, the consumer demand, that sustainability, on the other hand, is also being seen as almost a business necessity. So it's a way to save money if you do it right, because you're conserving resources, you're recycling, whatever the mechanism is that you're using to save money. Some forms of alternative energy are becoming more economical than right. Traditional ones. I mean, would you agree with that?
Yes, and again, that goes back to that first one. Is I think companies now are pushing forward with their research and pushing forward with their innovation and saying, okay, we're looking for new, innovative, sustainable ideas, but let's make sure we have let's justify where that economic sustainability is. And then suppliers of that type of thing are also doing the same thing. They're realizing, okay, I can't just sell this on being biodegradable or, compostable or recyclable. I've got to sell some economics in there. And the economics may not be spread just to that company, but throughout the whole industry, as far as we're using less resources in this. So we take a petroleum polymer, we blend it with a plant-based polymer. And so it's not fully, say, compostable or something, or even recyclable, but we're using less of the petroleum-based polymer in our total package format. So that is a sustainable option there to do. And you see people doing that. One other thing I would add is the sustainable concept is a very, very a popular one now, in a sense. I just talked to one of my former grad students last week, and he's looking to move in the job market, and he's in packaging area, and sustainable packaging positions at large, multinational consumer brand companies, both food and otherwise, are putting in positions of sustainability director or packaging sustainability, coordinator, whatever. So you're seeing a lot of movement in that area for somebody in the business model to say, what is going to be our approach? What's going to be our plan for how we address the sustainability question. And the beauty of sustainable is it's very, a broad definition, so we can define it whatever way works for our consumer and our company. And I would encourage everybody to seek that out.
Okay. You mentioned too, you just mentioned compostable. We actually have received quite a few questions ahead of time asking about, what's the difference between recyclable and compostable? What are the pros and cons? If you could please address that.
Yeah. And I'll also, there was another one too, just sort of pros and cons, you're right, of those things. So when we say compostable, also some people use words here that are interchangeable. So compostable and biodegradable, we sort of can maybe put those together. Compostable would technically mean that you can put it in a compost pile and it would biodegrade in that compost pile and turn over. And there's not a lot of municipalities or cities that are set up to handle that, because it's a very labor intensive process. So consumers doing it at home, if you do it in your backyard or wherever you do it, that's a little different issue. But again, it does take energy. It takes time and effort to be able to do that. But a lot of municipalities are not doing that because they just don't have the resources today to handle that. And they do realize that there are some. So it's not a large scale, I think it's not a large scale thing pull through the industry to demand that. The biodegradable goes with that in the sense, people say, well, it'll biodegrade and it won't be on the roadside, so litter, because there's that part of the whole, packaging question is, well, I don't want to see it on the road. Well, that's not a packaging problem. That's actually a consumer behavior problem. And us solving that through the packaging is probably not the best and most economically efficient approach to be able to do that. Because people say, well, I'll get into a biodegradable packaging. Well, they'll throw it out and it'll still take it months to degrade, but the litter's still there, no matter what the packaging is. If it's recyclable, glass, aluminum, which are very easily recyclable, very cost efficient to do, you just have a glass bottle or aluminum tray on the side of the road to do that. But from a biodegradable standpoint, one of the problems that we see in the industry, and I've done a good bit of research with gelatin films, with starch-based films, trying to modify them to get them so they will stand up to the food packaging, both human and pet food market. And one of the problems with all these biopolymers is, based on their chemistry, their structure, they're very hydrophilic. We call them, they like water. So the base unit of that monomer likes water. And so that means it will take on water. Well, water is in all pet foods, even in large or small quantities. It may be bound. If it's a wet pet food, it's obviously going to have a lot of free water in it. So that tends to break down the packaging. So the packaging doesn't last very long. Well, it's got to last long enough to make it through, packaging, distribution to the consumer, and maybe sit on the consumer shelf for several weeks or something before it's actually used. So that's the conundrum. That's what we're having to deal with on the research side, is how do we make a package that's biodegradable, but it doesn't do it on the Walmart shelf. It does it, once it gets to when it's in use. And so that's one of the hard things. The other one is finding the properties in it that you need. Biopolymers are fairly good oxygen barrier properties, but they're very poor on their water vapor properties because, again, they're hydrophilic. So we've tried to modify them with other things that are, say, bio in source, like nanoclays, for example. Nanoclays incorporated into gelatins and starch-based films can increase their water vapor barrier, but it still makes the product still hydrophilic. So it still wants water and it'll still break down. But there has been some changes in that area to move and get us that way.
Well, you've mentioned consumer behavior and the fact that most municipalities cannot support composting on a large scale. Someone commented that industrial composters do not want to take packaging as it degrades their end product, which makes some sense. But really, some of the statistics I read is that recycling among consumers is not at that high of a level, at least in the U.S. and maybe other places. And partially it's consumer behavior. Partially it's, more and more municipalities are having trouble supporting that. True. From what I understand.
True. No, I agree completely. Let me back up real quickly. One thought I had on the compostable too, and it sort of blends into this recyclable part, is most of and we're going to speak to the U.S. first. In the U.S., most of our solid municipal waste goes to the landfill. Okay, so we can debate that whole issue. That's a whole segment in and of itself. It is the most economically sustainable, economically friendly way to take care of solid municipal waste. So the landfill, and I've talked to landfill operators, they are not concerned about biodegradability, and they are not concerned about, compostability. What they are concerned about is space. Because if we, in just a simple version, if we dig a hole in the ground and we've got a limited hole to put, waste into it, volume of waste going in there is our critical factor. The landfill operator will tell you, I'm worried about the volume. I'm not worried, because they really don't want it to break down once it goes into the soil and is buried. Because if it does, a plastic that breaks down into small monomers gets into the water, and then we got bigger issues to deal with. You've seen that in multiple locations. So they're worried about size of the volume of the packaging. So going from a rigid package to a flexible package, I would say it's a sustainable option, because it takes rigid package that's empty, that takes up a lot of space in the landfill. And now when it goes there, it can be as flat as a piece of paper almost, and take up much less space in the landfill. So that's, again, a different approach to sustainability question. Now back to your recyclable. The recyclable thing is, it has to be economically driven. And the two major ones that we see out there, three actually, that pull through the market, that have always been this way, is glass is very recyclable. You go to any glass plant, they have a amount, certain percentage of cutlet that goes into the waste stream. It goes into the sand and the silica and everything that it takes to make glass. You'll see broken glass just thrown in there. The second one would be aluminum. Aluminum is, for many, since the invention of aluminum and making it into packaging, it's been economically friendly from a recyclability standpoint. Just recently, I've noticed, though, in the last year to two, the Aluminum Association has really picked up on, and I don't understand why, but all of a sudden they've picked up on the fact that their material can be recycled endlessly. Glass can do the same thing. Plastics cannot, and paper cannot. You cannot just recycle paper endlessly, because the chains of the papers, the fibers, will get shorter and shorter and shorter to the point they're not usable. But glass and aluminum are not that way. And all of a sudden, aluminum on the human food side has become the answer. It's become the sustainable, rescuer, because they say it's fully recyclable every time. And there's a waste stream that'll take it and pull it through. Most municipalities will collect aluminum cans and aluminum containers. Now, during COVID this past year, I would dare say most of us have seen a change in recycle rates that have gone down. I know my landfill and my convenience center, where we take our trash in South Carolina, we were separating our trash, we were recycling, everything. When COVID hit, all of a sudden, plastic went away, glass went away, and aluminum went away. They still do corrugated, paper. That's the other one, the other material that does that. But the corrugated, they still do, but they would not. And I asked the operator, I said, so when are we going to get plastic and glass and stuff back? And she said, I don't know, but it's until the cost of us shipping it is greater than what we get for it, and they won't do that. So, but I have to say this, between my house and the university, I pass every day a large plastic recyclable plant that is new. And I just noticed in the last 2 months, they have expanded. They've put up a bunch of new facilities, and they are growing. So I'm hoping that that's going to help us, because the better job we do pulling it and finding value in this recyclable material, the better job we will do at recycling. If you're old enough like me, you remember when you were a kid, you had every Coke bottles were in glass. And if you wanted to go get a candy bar on Saturday, you'd go out in the road or wherever and collect some bottles and take them to the local little convenience store, and you'd get a nickel for each one, and you had enough to buy a candy bar. So there was an economic incentive to do that again. So, we have to look at that. So recyclable, as we get out of plastics, and I'll say plastics, petroleum-based plastics, we can have biopolymer plastics also. If we have more than one layer, multiple materials, and as most of our packaging does, outside of bread bags and things like, milk containers, they're hard to recycle. Separating all those polymers, it's like mixing all the ingredients of a cake together and baking the cake and say, hey, I just want the flour back now. Well, you can't do that because you mixed it all together. And so the same thing's true on our pet food packaging. Most of our pet food packaging has multiple plastics, and separating them becomes hard. And the other one is on that, don't forget, petroleum-based plastics come from the gas and the oil industry, where we take crude oil and we make gas for our cars and trucks and things we drive. That's a byproduct. If we don't use it to make plastic, that's why we started doing it after World War II, then what are we going to do with all that? You know, you say, well, we'll just drive electric cars. Well, that could work in some, scenarios, but you still got to get, all those materials that you're making for the petroleum part. It's not going to go away. So if we don't use it for packaging, then what are we going to use it for? And so you can't forget that part of it.
Right. Well, speaking of plastic, there's a few questions coming in about that. So someone has commented, a few people commented that in the EU, they have an initiative, CFlex, that's aiming at trying to stress monomaterial food packaging to make recycling easier.
Yes.
And there's another comment. Yeah, so it's a similar comment, is that anything that is not easy to reuse without involving chemical means to make it reusable, then that's not considered recyclable. So, I mean, where is I guess this is maybe a pretty broad question, but where is the plastics industry, the food and pet food industries at trying to figure out that, yes, providing a plastic bag, which obviously are very popular and very convenient in many ways, yes, but also have that problem where they have so many layers that they're not easily recyclable.
Right. And let's remember now, they put those layers in there because there's an economic, value to doing that, because it gives them more oxygen barrier if they need for the product to make it last longer, or they need more moisture barrier, or they need more strength so it doesn't come apart before it gets to the consumer. But I am aware, just even in my lab work that I do, because I work with a lot of packaging companies and pet food companies on pet food packaging. I can't get into details from confidentiality, but I can say this: there's numerous projects, and have been for the last 5 years or more, I know specifically, of companies that are petroleum-based packaging companies that are looking to single source their packaging that is now, let's say, 3 layers. They're trying to get it to a single layer and doing things to modify that, to other things to do. And one would be something as simple as a cap on top of some type of condiment like ketchup or mustard or mayonnaise or a gravy for pet food or whatever it would be, and not have to have things like the induction foil liner that goes on the inside of that container. Yeah, that's a tamper evident thing, but we can deal with that a different way. But it's mainly there to keep oxygen from moving into the top of that container. So there's a lot of companies looking now, how can we modify our plastic? Let's take something like high density polyethylene, a very common plastic. Most of your milk jugs, a lot of your caps in the industry are made out of that. How can we get that? It's not a great oxygen barrier, but how can we modify it so that it does, but yet still gives us all the things we look for in HDPE as far as strength and heat resistance and those kind of things. So yes, there is a big push now from the R&D side, from the packaging field, trying to single source, get away from these multi-layer materials to be able to do it.
So someone had asked when we were talking about composting, I mean, do you have a crystal ball to say, if you have an idea of where all this is going, are we going to be moving to more biodegradable materials? Are we going to be moving to the single layer plastics? Combination thereof, maybe.
I think the single layer to me has more economic viability in the short term, because again, that makes a recycle stream become easy, that we can pull it through. The biodegradable part, I've never been one that's been that sold that has massive value in the marketplace. It sounds good on the evening news. It sounds good in some protest in front of the nation's capital or something. But in reality, and what we need in the marketplace from a consumer, because if I pick up a package in the store that's your package and it's biodegradable and it's already started doing that on the shelf before I get it to my house, I'm not ever buying that product again. So, and consumers are going to be that way. So, and I'm just, again, I'm not convinced that most municipalities are going to invest in huge composting facilities to be able to do that. And most consumers are showing you that's not something, they'll talk about it, but most of them don't have compost heaps in their backyard. You know, 80-20 rule pretty well holds in this case too.
Right.
80% of the market has got a limited amount of resources that they're going to spend for human food, pet food, all the things they want. So thinking their 80% is going to change and all of a sudden go biodegradable, I think is not very wise in that. So I don't see a long-term thing there, but I think the push for monolayer materials, I think is one that has value. I think it works both for people that are petroleum and people that are not, to get it single layers. Then it makes the recycle stream become easy. That's why milk jugs are so easily recyclable. You know, if you go into a milk plant, they will actually they blow their own jugs, they fill the milk in the plant, and the jugs that are deformed and don't get made correctly before they get to the filler, guess where they go? They blow them, they chop them up, go right back to the extruder, and they extrude them again and do it again. So that's a very easy one. We've already seen we can make outdoor furniture, we can make park benches, we can make a lot of things out of that material. Now, is it endlessly recyclable? It's not, but at least by using another use, you know, reusing it in another venue, that delays the time before it ever gets to the landfill.
Okay, and we've talked about you've talked a lot about the difficulty of recycling multi-layer materials, especially plastics, because of those multi-layers. There's been a few questions and comments about chemical recycling, and maybe you addressed that partially with that discussion.
Yeah, and I'm assuming on the chemical recycling, we're talking about treating it chemically to break the materials down. So let's take something like a wet pet food pouch. You know, it's going to be 3 and 4 layers of material: polypropylene, nylon, polyester, and maybe some aluminum. So how do you get those? They've been all put together with adhesives, with glues, basically, to get them to stick together. How do you separate those so I can take the polyethylene, polypropylene, which is a reusable, recyclable material? How do I separate it from those other 3 things? Is we do it chemically. You know, we put some type of chemical agent in there to break down that adhesive. That's a very expensive process, and you have to have, you know, significant volumes of product to justify doing that. So long term, you know, there may be some work in trying to make that more efficient and more economically friendly to do that, but you know, really it's a very difficult thing. What's going to be the easier and more economically friendly and efficient approach would be finding a single layer material. Consumer could just throw in one bin at the local convenience center, and then that bin get picked up by a truck and go straight to a recycling facility to be reprocessed and reused in something else. There are some work being done now by, can't get into details, but I know some companies are looking at how do I take a 2 and maybe even 3 layer material and heat process them and separate out the different plastics based on their melting points and their chemical makeup. And that's another option. I can't get into details, but I do know that work is being done now. So I think you could see that being down the road an option. Is that we would have a machine that you could throw a milk jug, a ketchup bottle, and a, you know, plastic pet food container in, and it would recycle that. It would take and melt those out and separate them out into 3 different streams. Then that material gets used for other types of products. One of the problems we have in the U.S., we can't recycle today a ketchup bottle and then put all that back into a ketchup bottle again. You know, that PET or whatever goes there, it might also been blended with a PET bottle that had, you know, motor oil in it. And so there's that, you know, issue you got to deal with on the recycle side. So there's going to need to be some work done there to how do we get that packaging to be more like virgin, even though it comes through the recycle stream, so we don't damage our pets or we damage ourselves if it's human food.
Right. Yeah, there was a question about, I have to go back and find it. Sorry. Speaking of, I think you're addressing some regulations here too, possibly getting to the regulatory area. Are you aware of any legal initiatives here in the U.S. to regulate claims on recyclability?
That's a very good question. I am not, but I know, for example, there's a multi-layer, and I won't say the name, there's a multi-layer package that is in the U.S. That for years now has said they are recyclable. And I've actually addressed them in a packaging conference one time, and it's 7 layers thick, and it's got every layer of other outside of glass. It's got every other material that we talk about, 4 basic materials. It's got plastic, got aluminum foil, and it's got paper. And I was like, so how do you claim it's recyclable? Because, you know, you've got 7 layers, and how do you get that? Well, they can all be separated. And then I asked, I said, well, can you give me one example of a place where that is being done in a municipality? And the answer was no. So I think that might be some talk in, you know, the political realm about that, but the ability to enforce that, and who's going to enforce it, and that becomes a harder thing. So I'm not aware of any initiative, and I think it would be opening a Pandora's box on how you're going to enforce that.
Yeah, I think if you got into regulating more closely a lot of marketing claims in pet food and human food and otherwise, it would probably be a Pandora's box.
Right. So, and people always find a way around it, but somehow, some way.
Right. So we're getting a few technical questions. I'm not sure how technical we want to get, but so for example, any recommendation to replace an aluminum barrier in a lamination? Are high barrier substrates also sustainable?
The thing I would say is going to depend on what the product is itself, whether it's a wet pet food or a dry pet food or a kibble or treat or something like that. There are some that are, you know, let's say polymer based. Again, one I could say might be, I know there's work being done by the high density polyethylene suppliers that they could get their oxygen barrier up. In fact, one of the large ones was working with me several years ago, and we just had a discussion about, you know, where do we see some things going? And I said, well, to me, if you guys could figure out a way to take high density polyethylene and put oxygen barrier in it, you've got value in the marketplace. So I know they're looking to do that. But aluminum is a very good barrier to both oxygen and moisture. It's also recyclable. The problem is we're burying it inside plastic. So to get it out and to be able to do that is an issue and hard to do. So there's not a one source replacement for aluminum. On a wet pet food side, a lot of people are going to coated polyester, PET. And I say coated like silicone oxide coated. For these are for wet, both cat and, you know, dog pet foods, and do a lot of work with that industry actually. And those are very good. The beauty of them is, you know, you can make a clear material. You don't have the aluminum foil. The problem is you still got is recyclable. You still marrying that with polypropylene and maybe another layer of polyester. So you might be down to 2 materials now, but you still got to separate those 2 to recycle them.
Okay. The question that we just had a few minutes ago about the regulatory and legal claims, several people commented that there is an FTC green guides for packaging that guides claims. So they provide guidance about recyclability claims. So
right.
If people want to check that out. And also, you know, in terms of like the whole research on how to separate, you know, multiple materials in plastic bags. I know that there are initiatives such as the Pet Sustainability Coalition has done a pilot project with a few retailers, pet retailers, and I forget, I'm sorry, the other entities are working with, but to do a pilot, you know, can we help consumers recycle more by having them be able to bring their bags to the pet store? And right. Then they're working with, you know, other vendors to work on the whole separation and then reusing those materials. I think they've just did one pilot program so far. But that does bring, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Another option on those, you know, sometimes on, let's say something like a dry pet food, you know, we've had dry pet foods out there for many years, kibble and stuff that is in multi-layer bags. And we've seen recently, you know, a trend in the last 5 to 10 years where people go into single layer bags, but it might have multiple plastics in that layer. So we don't have that big, thick, you know, paper, poly, you know, bag there to do it. That helps. One, it's a volume thing. When it goes to the landfill, it takes up less space. But if we can get that bag, and there might be some there that could do that, so that it has both the oxygen and the moisture barrier we need, to me, there's a big, you know, thing, because that's a lot of packaging, you know, in the marketplace that you could be able to do that. And these guidelines and stuff are great. That gives people things to work off of. They're not legally enforceable. Obviously, that's why they call them guidelines to do. And again, if we do get into the legal part, we all know 2 things are going to happen. One, it won't be enforceable, and taxes are going to go up because somebody's got to pay for how we're going to do that.
True. This is true. So we've talked a little bit about sealing options, and I know we've had some questions coming beforehand. We've had some come in this morning. What are some alternatives to sealing bags, whether recyclable or plastic bags, because of like, for example, which sealing bars are the most normally used or recommended for PEP or BOP woven bags? And then the other question,
yeah.
Yes.
So some people, obviously, stitching is something we used years ago to do bags like that. But you could also get to a point that maybe you could use something like a water-based adhesive that you could do. We do that in the corrugated industry a lot, and those adhesives are, they set very quickly. And so you can get them on a high-speed line, because again, back to the economics, we can't get away from. We've invested millions of dollars in these high-speed lines to package our product, and it has to work there. So an adhesive, and we see that in some industries. Most of our snack food questions, our snack food products have what we call an adhesive seal on them. If you take a candy bar and you pull that seal apart, you'll notice it as you pull it apart, little strings of material on there. That's the adhesive that sealed it together. It's not heat sealed together. So that's one way. The person mentioned here, and I was just ready to go to, is outside of heat, there's other methods for doing that. Ultrasonics is one of those, where we take sound waves like you would get an ultrasound, and we vibrate those polymers and get them to heat up. They're still heating up, and then they will melt and seal together. The beauty of those are they will seal through some other package or some products. Certain products they will actually sort of cut through and seal, but I can tell you from experience, they don't solve every problem. They have their own issues, just like any other mechanical process does, but that is another option to be able to do that.
Okay.
And I would say too, Debbie, on all these things that we're talking about, and we all need to remember, if it was easy, we would already be doing it.
True.
So it's going to be hard. It's going to take all of our brain power trying to figure out. And people say, well, you're researching something that's not going to be applicable for 20 years. True, but that's my job. And that's what's fun to do, is to start looking and then live long enough that you can see, well, I was looking at that 20 years ago, and now it's come to fruition. Now it's come to the market. So I think we just need to remember that we all got to keep working toward this as we move forward. It won't be solved tomorrow.
Right. What about, I think we had this discussion last year on another chat, but what about edible packaging materials for pets? Is that suitable?
That's on the human food side. I'm not aware on the pet food side yet, but on the human food side, we see that in certain things with coatings. So we can put coatings on certain things, and primarily it might be a fruit or something like that. And I have seen it even on some snacks, some more organic type snacks that can do some coatings that you would put on there, because they don't need, the product itself has enough inherent ability and characteristics that it doesn't need a lot of other barrier properties. Main thing you want to do is, prevent it from getting contaminated with something else or bacteria getting into the product itself. So I do think that could be a place on maybe things like snacks and treats, that we could do that. And then the primary, because don't forget, and we did a whole presentation, Debbie, on packaging functions, and there's 4 basic functions, and one of those functions of a package is containment. So if you're making snacks, well, you can coat them and they might last longer than putting them in a real high barrier bag. But if you could coat them and they would last longer, then you could put them in a single layer paper or some type of plastic or packaging that didn't have a lot of cost associated with it, and it's just containing the product, be able to put our label on it, those kind of things. So that is, I think, a very innovative way to think about the sustainability question is. And that's another one. Whenever we're talking about products and package and sustainability, we can't separate the two. So what things can we do on the product side that we could modify our product slightly, that we don't need as much packaging? And that's one. And I'll give you an example of how I've seen people do this the wrong way. So I'm a big coffee drinker, and my wife does not. So I buy Keurig cups because I don't want to brew a whole pot of coffee, unlike my parents who will do that and let it sit there all day long and drink it all day long. And by the end of the day, your tongue's rolling. It's so bitter, from sitting there. So I get the Keurig cups. Well, I got one day, and it was a company, and I won't pick on them. I'll just say that they were unique. And I said, well, I'll try that one. And it said on the outside, less plastic packaging, because there's this big concern that Keurig cups are going to fill up the landfill. I've been to the landfill recently, and I did not see one Keurig cup in the landfill. I did see a lot of other things like, couches and big things, but not any Keurig cups. But they said that. So I opened the package. It was in a paperboard carton, just like all the rest of them are on the grocery store shelf. But when I got inside, it was inside of a stand-up 4-layer, probably, I couldn't tell for sure, 4-layer stand-up pouch with a fold-over seal on the top of it, of aluminum foil seal on top of it. So, and then when I got the Keurig out, the little cup, instead of it being solid plastic all the way around, the top was just like the rest of them, but the bottom was more like a mesh, like a coffee filter. So that was where they said they got rid of the plastic, but they added a whole nother layer of packaging that they didn't tell you about. But on the outside, it said, back to our point about enforceable claims, said they use less plastic. I said, I'm not convinced there's less plastic in here, because that bag's got a lot of plastic in it. It's got aluminum foil in it. So again, we got to be a little careful on those kind of things. Sometimes we cut off our nose to spite our face in that.
We have had a few questions and comments come in today about, obviously one way to address sustainability is to use fewer packaging materials. Are there other innovations that you're seeing either in human food or pet food in terms of ways to do that? And you mentioned that you can't separate it from the product. So can you comment any on examples of ways to cut down on the amount of materials being used or the number of materials being used?
I think two, probably one. One, as I said earlier, is blending bio or plant-based even. And it could be not even just plant-based. Like I said, I've done a good bit of work with fish gelatin, because the fish industry they'll take if you've been to a salmon plant, processing plant, they take a big, large fish like that. They'll cut 2 fillets out of it on either side, and the rest of that goes for pet food sometimes. But then there's a whole nother gelatin part of that industry too. The gelatinous portion of all that is out there, and it becomes a waste product. And so what do we do with it? So we did some modification to look at modifying those. PLA has been out for many, many years, a plant-based material from corn and stuff to do that.
Right.
And so those now are starting to see them blending with other materials that are petroleum-based, like PLA can be blended with things like PET. So you'll see people using 30% plant-based material in the middle of their petroleum-based package. And to me, that's a sustainable option, because we're using less PET and we're using this other plant-based material. So we go back to our economics. The more we use of that plant-based material, the supplier of that is going to be able to do, or she will be able to do more efficient production. The cost will go down. If the cost go down, what's going to happen to demand for it? It's going to go up. So the more we can get these biomaterials out there and get them used, then the cost will go down. We can see that in a lot of places. The other one would be, don't forget tying the product with the package and being able to, I've seen people do this. They will modify slightly their product, so that they don't have to have all those things in the package they have to pay for. And that's a good way to get around it. Is, can we make a slight change in the formulation to give us longer shelf life, so we don't have to have the package to be able to do that? And then another one, Debbie, it just came to my mind, you might see, is we could get by with maybe modifying the atmosphere of the package in the product, like a nitrogen flush or a CO2 flush, where we can extend shelf life, because everybody wants longer shelf life. Walmart, Costco, Fresh Market, Whole Foods, whoever, nobody wants short shelf life, because they're an economic driver if there ever has been. So if you got a short shelf life on your product, they're probably not going to buy it. Especially if I'm your competitor and I got a long one. So that's another way, because the gas will extend the shelf life. You don't have to have things in the product to do it. But you may have to have barrier in the packaging, but it could be a single layer material to do that.
Okay. We had a few questions come in, just switching a little bit to a specific type of pet food product. We had several questions come in about fresh pet food, because that's a fast growing part of the pet food industry, fast growing segment. Are there more packaging options and specifically more sustainable options for fresh pet food that you're aware of?
I would say they're from a food science. I'm a food scientist at heart, though I'm focused on food packaging. Food science standpoint, yes, because we're not shelf stable. So there's three ways the local consumer store, grocery store, whatever it is, big box store stores your product: shelf stable, refrigerated, and frozen. Frozen and shelf stable give you very long shelf life. Refrigerated, the shelf life is either maybe in days or weeks or months. It's a lot shorter. But the refrigeration temperatures mean that we're controlling those reactions by the temperature, not by the packaging. So typically the packaging in the refrigerator doesn't have to have as much oxygen barrier and moisture barrier as it would if we were to make that same product shelf stable and do that. But they're also going to do things like gas flushing. The meat industry, the red meat industry in our country, they have been gas flushing for many, many years, because red meat, will change color, once exposed to oxygen. So they can do that. And I think you're seeing that, and we'll see that in the fresh market. We make fresh pet food like that we're going to have to do something, because if a consumer picks up something that's supposed to be a red, ground beef looking type fresh product and it's brown, they're not buying it. I don't care if you've got it in the most economically sustainable packaging known to man. So that becomes a conundrum. How do we deal with that part? But I do think we don't have to have as much oxygen and or moisture barrier in those products in the refrigerator as you would other, because already the product itself is not going to last for months. So you don't have to have the barrier to get it there.
That makes sense. We had a question. This is kind of helps encapsulate the whole idea of sustainability, I think. Are you aware of any life cycle analysis studies available that compare different packaging solutions for pet food, specifically dry pet food is what the person's asking about?
I'm not specifically. I think those are all great questions. And I think, but you got to be careful, because some people do life cycle analysis to fit their agenda.
Right.
So we have to make sure that it encompasses everything. So let's just go back on to one this one I know of. For example, PLA I mentioned earlier. We've done work in my lab with PLA before, polylactic acid. So it's a polymer. It comes from corn. So we can grow corn and do that. So if we go back to our basic economics, then we have corn growers that grow corn, farmers all over the United States, around the world. So corn primarily has been used for a couple of things in the past. Human food, obviously cornmeal, corn flour, all the things that corn sugar, that we use. Animal food, so we feed cows and chickens and hogs and all kind of things with it. And then we got into, just when the energy crisis and stuff hit, we get into using corn to make, ethanol, so we can put it in our gas and not have to use as much petroleum-based gas to be able to do that. Well, now we add to that a PLA market for packaging. So if you remember your economics, instead of we got three demand curves, now we got 4 for corn. What's the price of corn going to do? It's going to go up, because we got a demand for it. And so it's going to go up. So all those others, the human food, don't forget, the animal foods, and the ethanol, all that's going to go up. So that's one of those areas that, we look at the total life cycle analysis. Well, I think they forget that part sometimes. To make these plant-based polymers, we're using petroleum-based polymers, because we're taking tractors and utensils or equipment. They're all petroleum driven. So you don't make plant-based materials without some investment of petroleum-based materials. And even on corn with PLA, any study I've ever seen says it takes more petroleum-based gas to grow an acre of corn to make enough PLA to substitute for PET, for example, which is what it substitutes in the marketplace, than if you just took it and made straight PET with it. That's why you don't see, in a lot of these, ethanol plants that are doing for gas and stuff, they've had a bunch of government support to try to get them going, because they can't be economically viable to run sometimes.
Right. Yeah, I think with life cycle analysis, it's a great tool, but from what I understand, it's just not standardized for most areas. Right. Yeah. So as you said, you can use it to show what you want.
Exactly.
we've kind of skirted around the issue of consumer behavior, littering versus do they recycle or something. There was a question that came in earlier about consumer education. Do you have any tips or thoughts on how companies, brands can better educate consumers about
I think
sustainability?
I mentioned earlier, I think one that's recent is just the aluminum industry has all of a sudden realized that our big value add to the packaging market is that our base material is fully recyclable, that it can go recycle multiple times through. And the best example I can think of with that is after World War II in the South, there was aluminum coming back to the US in the form of airplanes from World War II. And there was a huge Alcoa plant in Knoxville, Tennessee, right outside of Knoxville. And they took all these aluminum from the planes and they turned it into aluminum siding and aluminum roofing and stuff. So out the Southeast where I live, you'll see old barns with aluminum, there to be able to took that product and used it to be able to do that. So I think, that kind of being able to go back to their roots and say, hey, this is something that can fully recyclable is a good thing. I think we need to do a better job with consumers on telling them, first and foremost, are you willing to pay for it? Because if you are not, then we're all wasting our time. And most consumers in today's market, and you can't get away from that. There's a book out many years ago called the 80-20 rule. And if you read that, I think, and I've learned after 58 years on this earth, there's a lot of 80-20 everywhere you look.
Yes.
So 80% of the consumers going into the market are not willing to give up some of their resources to buy something that is biodegradable or biofriendly. And just here's a real easy way to figure that out. Who sells more product in the United States? Walmart, Target, or Whole Foods? Whole Foods is the, organic, fresh, everything, because everybody doesn't shop at Whole Foods. Now, are they a limited market? Yes. If you're in that market as a pet food supplier, then I think you probably wouldn't want to focus on sustainable, biodegradable, recyclable options. But if you're going to Walmart and you're selling in there on that, they're not the biodegradable leader. They're what? The low price leader. So, I think it just economically, it's not a wise choice to focus too much on that area. But I do think that we can do a better job educating consumers that there is a long-term cost to packaging waste. But there's also another part of that is how do we make our products last longer with things like making it convenient for the consumer to use the package, like cheese, for example. Use cheese, you used to buy it in blocks at the local store, and you cut it off and you had to throw away part of the cheese because it was, dried out and turned back, maybe even molded on the edge. Well, then we went to single pack cheese where we can just get a slice, and every time the slice is very good for us. Which one takes more packaging? The single slice does.
Sure.
But we don't waste as much food. And so, a lot of times in our industry, we forget that part. If we didn't have packaging out there, we'd be wasting a lot more food. And if you go to an underdeveloped country, and there was a study done many years ago by one of my previous colleagues, and they went to Mexico City, and they looked in the landfill, and the bulk of the product in the landfill was food, not packaging. Well, something's going to go to the landfill, and my preference would be packaging, not food, whether it's human food or pet food.
Right. Yeah, and I think we all know human food is definitely on the radar of being a very large problem. Food waste, I'm sorry, is definitely on the radar of being a large problem for many reasons, economically, sustainability. One last area we haven't really addressed a lot is packaging machinery, and not so much how sustainable those are, because obviously those have to run on some form of energy. But are there certain types of packaging materials that are better in the automated process of putting pet food in a bag, for example?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. Again, and I'm not saying there's not. I'm just saying I'm not aware of. But I would say that is definitely a legitimate concern. Is we've got money invested in these high-speed lines, whether it's vertical form fill and seal, horizontal form fill and seal, where it's a bag filler, pouch filler, whatever it is. We are not running those things slow. And so if you incorporate some type of biomaterial in there or sustainable packaging, and it slows that line down, then cost obviously immediately goes up. And if we paid more for that packaging too, now we got two increased costs. Both the base material costs more, and our line runs slower. So that gets back to that life cycle thing we sort of talked about, Debbie, in the total, looking at the total packages. How does that work for us? Some paper, products making large paper bags, that may be more applicable than it could be on the polymer side for making a fully petroleum-based plastic bag, because the seal times, what we call hot tack, which is when we push the plastic together and with heat on it, how quickly does it stick together or tack together? If that changes by going to a bio-based material, then the cost all of a sudden goes through the roof. And performance, if it doesn't stick together and stay together, then now we got leaking bags, and that's not going to help anybody in the long run. So, but I'm not aware of any, say, material, everybody's looking for one material that does that. I'm not, but I would say, as you are evaluating materials, because your suppliers and people are going to be coming to you with these, that's something to consider is, will it run as fast on my line as my current materials do?
Good point. Yeah. As you said, it's a very complex situation. And if it were easy, we would have figured it out by now.
Figured it out a long time ago.
As with a lot of things.
Yes.
Well, we're almost at the top of the hour. We've covered a lot of ground. So thank you, everyone, for participating. Thanks very much to Scott for your discussion, and your valuable insights. Folks, if you want to continue your education on sustainability, packaging, or any other industry topics, please consider registering for Pet Food Forum 2021, which returns as an in-person conference and exhibition in September. We also will have an on-demand version. You can find the agenda and registration information at petfoodforumevents.com, and early bird savings are still available for just a few more days. Our next Ask the Pet Food Pro Chat is on August 25th, featuring Julian Stouffer, CEO of Waldner North America, answering questions about the total cost of ownership of a pet food production line. And that chat is being also sponsored by Waldner, so thank you to them. Thanks very much again to Peel Plastics for sponsoring today's chat. And with that, I will say goodbye. Thank you. And meanwhile, enjoy the rest of your day and your evening.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.